The cafeteria line at Camp McCoy smelled wrong. Mitsuo Fuchida had expected disinfectant and boiled cabbage. The scent of defeat. Instead, the April air carried something sweet, artificial, chemical, distinctly American. He shuffled forward with the other Japanese prisoners, still wearing his flight jacket with the collar insignia removed. 4 months ago, he had commanded what remained of Japan's naval aviation. Now he was processing into a POW facility in Wisconsin, a state he couldn't have located on a map before this war swallowed his life. The line moved. 20 men ahead of him. 15. He watched their faces as they reached whatever waited at the front. Each prisoner stopped, stared, took what they were offered with the careful, suspicious movements of men trained to expect tricks. 10 men. 5. The American MP came into view. A kid, really. Maybe 22, with the soft face of someone who'd never missed a meal. He stood behind a long stainless steel counter, fluorescent lights gleaming off its surface. But it was what sat on that counter that made Fuchida's breath catch. Ice cream. Not one container. 12 deep metal tubs sunk into a refrigerated well, each a different color under the harsh lights. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. Colors he didn't recognize. Green, purple, something swirled with ribbons of caramel. The prisoner ahead of him stepped forward. The MP didn't measure, didn't ration. He just dug his scoop into chocolate, then vanilla, and deposited a mass of both into a paper cup large enough to hold a man's rice ration for 2 days. He handed it over with the casual indifference of someone performing an action he'd already repeated 100 times that afternoon. Fuchida's turn. Flavor? The MP asked, his tone bored. The question seemed absurd. Fuchida pointed at vanilla, the only one he recognized with certainty. The scoop plunged in. The MP's wrist twisted with practiced efficiency, and suddenly, Fuchida was holding a cup of ice cream. In a prisoner of war camp. In Wisconsin. In April. He stepped out of line, unable to move further. His calculator mind, trained to plot navigation and fuel consumption across thousands of miles of ocean, engaged automatically. The electricity to maintain those freezers. Running 24 hours a day, in a building that also heated itself against Wisconsin's cold. The milk, from cows that could feed frontline troops. The sugar. God, the sugar. Japan's civilian ration was 400 grams per person per month, and that was before the Americans cut the shipping lanes. This single cup probably contained a week's worth. And the infrastructure, refrigerated trucks to deliver it from some factory he'd never heard of. The factory itself, running shift work, producing luxury goods while their nation fought a 2-ocean war. The fuel for those trucks, the rubber for their tires, the steel for their cargo beds. All of this, for prisoners, for the enemy. A Japanese, lieutenant stood against the far wall, his cup already half empty. Fuchida approached him. "This is real?" Fuchida asked in Japanese. The lieutenant nodded slowly. "Every Tuesday and Friday. Different flavors each time," he paused. "Sir, last week they had chocolate with cherries in it. Actual cherries." Fuchida looked down at his cup. The ice cream was already beginning to melt around the edges, cream pooling at the bottom. He took a small spoonful. The cold shocked his teeth. The sweetness, chemical, over-rich, distinctly American, coated his tongue. He thought of Midway, of his pilots climbing into their cockpits with 3 days' worth of rice balls wrapped in cloth, knowing that was all the food they'd get until they returned to the carriers. If they returned. He thought of the maintenance crews who couldn't get engine parts, who cannibalized one aircraft to keep 2 others flying. Of the pilots who died because their planes failed, not because the Americans shot them down. Someone bumped past him. He glanced up and saw the waste bin beside the exit. It was half full of melted ice cream. Discarded. Thrown away. Cups with entire scoops barely touched. The contents, now a swirled puddle of brown and pink and white. Enough calories in that bin to keep a man alive for 3 days. And the Americans were throwing it away because, what? Someone changed their mind about the flavor? Decided they weren't hungry after all? Fuchida had bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He'd led the first wave himself, watched the Arizona explode, coordinated the strike that killed over 2,000 Americans in a single morning. He'd studied the enemy for years before that, their tactics, their training, their equipment. He knew about American industrial capacity in the abstract, numbers in intelligence reports, factory counts, production estimates that his superiors dismissed as inflated propaganda. But he'd never understood. Not really. Not until this moment. The ice cream wasn't inefficiency. It wasn't waste in the way his training had taught him to recognize it. This was demonstration. This was the enemy saying, "We have so much that we can afford to give it to men who tried to kill us. We have so much we can throw away what's left." An American guard walked past, carrying a clipboard. He glanced at Fuchida, standing motionless in the middle of the cafeteria, then at the untouched cup in his hand. "Not a vanilla fan?" the guard asked. His tone was conversational, almost friendly. "Try the strawberry next time, it's better." He kept walking. Fuchida stared at his retreating back. The guard's uniform was clean, well-fitted. His boots had a shine. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where his next meal was coming from, and the one after that, and the one after that. Next time. The guard said next time like this was normal. Like feeding ice cream to Japanese prisoners was just standard operating procedure. Like abundance was the default state of being. Fuchida had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor in absolute secrecy. Every detail classified. Every document controlled. They'd maintained radio silence crossing the Pacific because a single intercepted transmission could have compromised everything. Security was survival. These Americans were giving him ice cream and telling him which flavor to try instead. He finally took another small bite. Then another. The cup grew lighter in his hand. Around him, other prisoners sat at long tables, eating their ice cream in silence or in small, hushed conversations. No one seemed to know quite how to process what they were experiencing. A young private walked through with a push broom, cleaning. He swept past Fuchida's feet without acknowledgement, without concern. Just another prisoner standing in his cafeteria. Just another Tuesday. Fuchida finished the ice cream. He dropped the empty cup in the waste bin, on top of all that melted abundance, and walked toward the barracks assignment desk. His war hadn't ended when Japan surrendered. It ended here in Wisconsin, watching an American kid scoop ice cream like it meant nothing at all. Because that was the point. To them, it did mean nothing. This wasn't special. This wasn't propaganda. This was just what they could afford to do. Everything he'd believed about American weakness, about soft democracies, about luxury breeding decadence, all of it dissolved in a paper cup of vanilla ice cream he couldn't even finish. The sacred warriors of Japan had fought with empty stomachs and failing engines. The Americans fed their prisoners dessert twice a week and threw away what they didn't want. Fuchida understood, finally, what he'd really been fighting all along. The library smelled wrong. Fuchida stood in the doorway of the Camp McCoy Recreation Building, June morning light streaming through high windows, and tried to identify what his senses were rejecting. Not unpleasant, just impossible. Paper. Binding glue. The particular mustiness of books left open in sunlight. Scents he associated with the Naval Staff College in Tokyo. Not a prisoner compound in Wisconsin. The room stretched wider than he'd expected. 20 feet of wooden shelving lined the far wall, sagging slightly under the weight of books. Actual books. Hundreds of them. Novels with bright dust jackets. Thick histories. Magazines fanned across reading tables like discarded playing cards. A Japanese lieutenant named Matsui sat near the window, absorbed in what appeared to be a life magazine. He didn't look up when Fuchida entered. The American MP at the door, A different boy than the ice cream scooper, this one with wire-rimmed glasses, gestured casually toward the shelves. "Help yourself, sir. Returns go in the bin by the door." He said it the way you'd direct someone to a public washroom. Mundane, expected. Fuchida moved toward the shelves, boots loud on the wooden floor. The fiction section meant nothing to him. English titles he couldn't parse. But then he saw the technical shelf. His hand stopped 6 inches from the spines. Aviation, mechanics, engineering manuals with precise, blocked typography. The kind of publications that should be buried in restricted archives, not sitting in open air for enemy hands to touch. He pulled the first one carefully, half expecting an alarm. The cover read, B-29 Superfortress, Maintenance and Operation Manual, Technical Order 01-20EJ2. Not a summary, not a propaganda piece, a technical order. The real manual American ground crews used to service the aircraft currently reducing Japanese cities to ash. Fuchida's fingers found the title page. Published by the United States Army Air Forces, March 1945. 2 months ago. Current. They were handing him current operational documentation. He opened to a random page. Detailed schematic of the pressurization system, every valve labeled. Every pressure specification listed. The exact engineering solution that allowed the B-29 to fly at 32,000 feet, above the reach of Japanese interceptors. The secret that made the Superfortress untouchable. Just sitting here. Available. His hands began turning pages faster. Fuel system diagrams. Engine maintenance schedules. Structural load calculations for the bomb bay. The weapons that were killing his countrymen. Dissected and explained with the clinical precision of a medical textbook. Page 47 showed the electrical system. Page 93. The fire suppression mechanisms. Page 112. A full breakdown of the remote-controlled gun turrets, the defensive system that had shredded so many attacking fighters. Everything he would have given a carrier group to obtain a year ago, bound in a manual someone had shelved between a book about trout fishing and a collection of popular mechanics. Good stuff in there. Fuchida looked up. The MP had moved closer, hands in pockets, gum working in his jaw. The boy couldn't have been more than 20. Probably never saw combat. Probably never saw much of anything beyond Wisconsin. The B-29, Fuchida said carefully, his English still rough-edged. Yeah. The guard leaned against the shelf. My uncle works at Boeing. Plant up in Wichita. Says they roll one of those off the line every 90 minutes now. Can you believe that? 90 minutes. He shook his head like it impressed even him. Says they're already designing the replacement, something even bigger. 90 minutes. Fuchida did the arithmetic automatically, a skill he couldn't shut off even when he wanted to. 16 aircraft per day from one plant, 480 per month, almost 6,000 per year, from one factory. Japan's entire aviation industry had produced 7,000 aircraft total in 1944. All types. All factories combined. The replacement, Fuchida repeated quietly. That's what he says. Wants to make it go even faster. Carry even more. The MP shrugged. Guess these things get obsolete pretty quick. Obsolete. The weapon that ended the war. Already outdated. Already being replaced by something the Americans would casually mention to prisoners while chewing gum. Fuchida set the manual down and reached for the next book, Aircraft Recognition Manual. Japanese types. He opened it to find silhouettes and specifications for every aircraft in the Imperial Navy inventory. The Zero, the Betty Bomber, the Judy Dive Bomber. Every weakness cataloged, every vulnerability noted. Beyond that, Industrial Production Statistics, 1944. He pulled it down. Flipped it open. Charts, graphs, production numbers for ships, tanks, aircraft, vehicles. Not estimates, actual figures, broken down by month and manufacturing region. The kind of intelligence that should be classified at the highest levels, printed in a bound report available to anyone who wanted to read it. A photograph stopped him cold. Willow Run, the bomber plant in Michigan. An assembly line stretching so far, the camera's perspective made it disappear into infinity. B-24 Liberators in various stages of completion, workers swarming like ants on a colony mound. The scale made him dizzy. The caption, Willow Run Plant, one of several Ford facilities producing combat aircraft. Peak production, 1 B-24 per hour, one of several. His fingers tightened on the page. At Nakajima Aircraft Company, Japan's largest manufacturer, they'd celebrated when monthly production hit 30 fighters. Celebrated like they'd won a battle. Meanwhile, Ford, a car company, was producing heavy bombers at a rate that would require him to count on his fingers to calculate the daily output. He turned the page. Another photograph. Women working an assembly line, installing electrical systems in B-17 fuselages. They looked bored. One was smiling at something off camera. They were assembling strategic bombers the way Tokyo workers assembled bicycles. Pretty amazing, huh? The MP again. Still watching. Still chewing gum. Fuchida wondered if the boy understood what he was looking at, or if this was just another day guarding prisoners who read books. Why? Fuchida asked. The guard's forehead creased. Why what? Fuchida gestured at the shelves, at the manual still open in his hands. Why you show this? Why you let us see? The MP considered this like it was a puzzle he'd never thought about. Guess there's no point hiding it now. War's over. And besides, he nodded toward the production statistics volume. Everybody knows. It's not like it's a secret that we make a lot of stuff. Not a secret. Making more war material than the rest of the world combined wasn't a secret. It was just a fact. Something obvious. Like mentioning the weather. Matsui looked up from his magazine across the room. They want us to know, he said in Japanese. That's the point. The MP glanced between them, not understanding the words, but reading the tone. He's right, Fuchida said, also in Japanese. He closed the manual, ran his hand across the cover. This isn't carelessness. It's a message. What message? Fuchida looked at the shelves. At the manuals for aircraft and ships and weapon systems. At the production statistics left open for enemy eyes. At the casual abundance of information matching the casual abundance of ice cream. That they were never worried about us learning their secrets, he said. Because it wouldn't have mattered. You can't copy capacity. You can't steal infrastructure. He picked up the B-29 manual again. We could have had these plans in 1941, and it wouldn't have changed anything. We didn't have the aluminum, the machine tools, the electricity, the workers, the trucks to move materials, the railways to supply the factories. He thought of the ice cream, the endless, impossible ice cream. They're showing us that the war was already over before it started. We just didn't know what we were fighting. The MP shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware they were discussing something beyond his comprehension. You guys need anything? I can grab more magazines from the office if you want. More. Always more. Fuchida almost laughed. No, he said in English. This is enough. He carried the B-29 manual to a reading table and sat. The chair was comfortable, actual padding, not bare wood. He opened the manual to the first page and began reading systematically, the way he'd once read intelligence assessments. By page 30, he understood the pressurization system better than he'd understood any Japanese aircraft he'd ever flown. By page 60, he'd counted 17 engineering solutions to problems Japanese designers hadn't even recognized as solvable. By page 90, he stopped seeing the B-29. He saw the system that built it, the infrastructure that made such casual sophistication possible, the industrial base so vast it could scatter technical manuals like propaganda leaflets. Outside the window, a truck rumbled past. Just another supply delivery. Routine. Expected. Unremarkable. Fuchida watched it disappear toward the warehouses and understood that the war had never been about courage or discipline or warrior spirit. Those were luxuries, expensive accessories. The war had been about trucks, and the enemy had more trucks than Japan had bicycles. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, appearing with the clockwork precision of everything American. An orderly called Fuchida's name during morning assembly, voice flat and bureaucratic, as if delivering mail from Japanese prisoners to devastated cities across the Pacific happened every day. Maybe it did. The envelope was thin, worn at the corners from its impossible journey. Fuchida held it like ordnance, turning it over in his hands. His wife's handwriting, the careful strokes he'd known for 15 years, addressed to him in Wisconsin. Through his mind ran the chain of logistics this required: sorting centers, military, transport planes, jeeps navigating bombed roads, some American postman finding his family's house in Nara, despite half the city being ash and rubble. He opened it, standing in the June sunlight, unwilling to wait for privacy. "Husband, your letter arrived yesterday. The children cried to know you are alive. We are managing. There is little rice, but we survive. I cannot believe the Americans fed you meat. I cannot believe they let you write. Come home safely." The paper trembled in his hands, not from emotion, from the weight of what this represented. 3 weeks. His letter had crossed an ocean, passed through military censors on both sides, navigated a postal system in a country whose infrastructure lay in ruins, and reached his wife's hands in 21 days. He'd written it expecting nothing, a gesture toward normalcy in a world that had abandoned such concepts. He'd assumed the letter would be destroyed, or lost, or filed away in some warehouse as evidence for war crimes trials that might never come. Instead, it had been delivered, as promised, with the casual efficiency of a system that simply worked. "Good news, I hope?" Lieutenant Matsui appeared at his elbow, the perpetual observer. Fuchida couldn't speak. He handed over the letter. Matsui read it, his expression shifting through the same equations Fuchida had just calculated. "They actually—" He stopped, started again. "The postal service still functions in Nara?" "Apparently. But the city was bombed. The rail lines—" "I know." They stood together in silence. 2 men trained in logistics and supply chains, confronting a system whose redundancies exceeded their conceptual framework. Fuchida thought of the mail he'd tried to send from forward bases during the war. Letters that took months if they arrived at all. Carrier pigeons that flew into storms. Dispatch riders who died on mountain roads. The Imperial Navy at its peak couldn't reliably move information 50 miles. The Americans were doing it across continents and oceans, to enemy families, as a matter of routine administration. "My wife wrote me last week," Matsui said quietly, "from Osaka. I thought—" He gestured helplessly. "I thought it was propaganda. That they'd forced her to write it, or fabricated it somehow." "Was it her handwriting?" "Yes." Matsui's voice was barely audible. "She mentioned things only she would know. Our daughter's nickname. The tree in our garden." More prisoners were receiving letters now. Fuchida watched them open envelopes with shaking hands, saw grown men weep at words from wives and mothers they'd expected never to reach. The Americans had provided pencils and paper, had established censorship protocols that somehow balanced security with basic humanity, had integrated enemy prisoner mail into a supply chain already moving millions of tons of material monthly, as an afterthought, as a minor administrative detail. That night, Fuchida learned the full scope from a talkative guard during dinner shift. The kid was maybe 20, from somewhere called Nebraska, and he talked while spooning out mashed potatoes with the same generous imprecision that characterized everything American. "Yeah, the APO system's pretty amazing," the guard said, not noticing, or not caring, that he was explaining military logistics to a former enemy commander. "Army post office. My brother's in the Pacific, writes home twice a week. Takes maybe 10 days for his letters to reach Mom in Omaha. She sends him cookies. They usually arrive unbroken. Fuchida accepted his tray, processed the information. 10 days. Cookies arriving intact across the Pacific. Supply chains so robust they could handle fragile baked goods. We process about 1 million pounds of mail daily, the guard continued, serving the next prisoner. That's just for the European theater. Pacific's probably similar. They built these distribution centers, see, with sorting equipment. Whole buildings just for mail. Wild, right? 1 million pounds? Daily. Just for letters and packages. Fuchida thought about the fuel required to move that weight. The vehicles, the personnel, the infrastructure. Resources that could have been ammunition or rations or replacement parts, instead allocated to maintaining morale through connection to home. And now extended to prisoners. To the enemy, he found a seat next to a younger pilot named Saito, who was also holding a letter, also looking stunned. My mother, Saito said. She's alive. In Hiroshima. They ate in silence, the dining hall buzzing with similar conversations. Men comparing delivery times, marveling at the intact condition of photographs that had survived transoceanic shipping, calculating the same impossible logistics equations. Fuchida returned to his bunk after dinner and began another letter. The Americans allowed 2 per month, another administrative detail that had required forms, protocols, translation services for censors, international coordination with Japanese authorities. Someone had spent actual time and resources creating a system to let prisoners write home. He described the library from last month, the ice cream that had shocked him at intake. He was careful with his words, knowing censors on both sides would read this, but the facts needed no embellishment. The truth was staggering enough. The guards treat us well. Better than well. We receive medical care when sick. The food is abundant. More than I can eat. They have given us books, paper, the means to write to you. I do not understand this enemy. I thought I did, but I was wrong about everything. He sealed the letter the next morning, handed it to the same orderly who delivered his wife's reply. The young man took it, added it to a canvas bag already half full of similar envelopes, nodded politely. Should reach Nara in about 3 weeks, sir, he said. Usual route. As if mailing letters to Japan from a POW camp in Wisconsin was normal. As if the machinery of connection operated independently of the war that had just ended. Fuchida watched the orderly leave with the mail bag. Somewhere, that bag would be loaded onto a truck, driven to a sorting facility, transferred to a train, then a ship, then another truck. Would pass through multiple hands, cross checkpoints and borders, navigate bombed cities and damaged roads. And it would arrive. Because the system didn't fail. That was the weapon he'd never anticipated. Not the B-29s or the submarines or the atom bombs. Those were just applications of capacity. The real weapon was the capacity itself. Industrial democracy functioning at a scale that permitted waste, forgiveness, inefficiency in service of humanity. Japan had taught him that strength came from sacrifice, from doing more with less, from spiritual superiority overcoming material disadvantage. He'd believed it completely, had led men into battle sustained by that belief. The Americans had proved the opposite. That abundance created options. That surplus enabled mercy. That overwhelming productive capacity allowed you to feed prisoners ice cream, stock libraries with classified manuals, deliver mail to enemy families, not despite fighting a war, but while waging it more effectively than anyone in history. 3 weeks later, his second letter reached Nara. His wife confirmed it in her next reply, which arrived with the same clockwork precision. She asked about the ice cream. Didn't believe it. Thought he was exaggerating or confused. He wasn't. If anything, he'd understated the scale, because you couldn't overstate something that defied your entire framework for understanding industrial warfare. Fuchida sat on his bunk that evening, holding his wife's second letter. looking around the barracks where 200 Japanese prisoners slept on actual mattresses with clean sheets changed weekly. Where the latrines worked, the showers had hot water. The infirmary stocked antibiotics, where mail arrived from Japan every week, regular as sunrise. He finally understood what he'd been fighting. Not a nation, a system. One so large and complex and robust that minor compassions like prisoner mail were rounding errors in its massive calculations. Where treating enemies humanely cost so little, relatively, that it wasn't even a choice worth debating. The war had been lost before it started. Not at Midway or Guadalcanal. The moment Japan chose to fight a country that could afford to care about the families of men trying to kill them. September 1945. Fuchida stood at the edge of what used to be Atsugi Air Base, his command post when he'd planned the Pearl Harbor strike. The runway still bore his operational markings, faded now beneath fresh American paint. 4 years ago, his Zero fighters lined these taxiways in perfect rows. Today, American Corsairs squatted where his aircraft once stood, their wings folded like birds at rest. The city beyond the perimeter fence was ash and silence. Every third building reduced to skeletal frames. The rest just gone, swept clean by firebombing raids he'd been powerless to stop. The air tasted of concrete dust and latrine pits. His children waited at what remained of his house, 3 miles distant. No shoes. Rice rations at 900 calories per day. His daughter's ribs visible through her shirt. His son's feet wrapped in newspaper because the cloth had worn through. Fuchida walked the fence line, uncertain why he'd come. To remember? To mourn? The base operated at full capacity under American occupation. More activity now than when it was Japanese. Transport planes landing every 20 minutes, their bellies full of supplies for the conqueror's comfort. Then he saw the line. Japanese civilians, hundreds of them, queued along the western fence where Americans had erected a distribution point. Old women, hollow-eyed men, children clinging to their mothers' legs. The same people he'd failed to protect, now dependent on enemy charity. Fuchida approached, instinct pulling him toward the source of his shame. He'd expected propaganda. Loudspeakers proclaiming American generosity. Photographers capturing gratitude for newsreels. The performance of mercy. What he saw instead stopped him cold. 2 lines. Adults to the left, children to the right. The adult queue moved efficiently. Canned goods, rice bags, medical supplies distributed by bored GIs checking clipboards. Mechanical. Procedural. But the children's line. An American sergeant, massive shoulders straining his uniform, was on his knees in the dirt, kneeling. Not standing over, not bending down. Fully kneeling in the dust and rubble of a conquered enemy's homeland. In front of him sat a Japanese girl, maybe 6 years old, skeletal thin with scabbed knees and matted hair. The sergeant held a pair of brown leather shoes. Fuchida watched him slip the first shoe onto her tiny foot. Too big, the sergeant set it aside, reached into a cardboard box, selected a smaller pair. Tried again. Still loose. He frowned, not impatient, not annoyed, just focused. The way a father would be. Third pair. He slid it on, pressed his thumb against the toe box to check clearance. Nodded. Fitted the second shoe. Then, with hands the size of dinner plates, he began to thread the laces. The girl stared at him, frozen. Probably never seen an American this close. Certainly never had one kneel before her. "There we go, sweetheart," the sergeant said in English she couldn't understand. His voice was soft. He tied the laces in careful double knots, tugged each to test the hold, then stood and offered his hand to help her up. She took it, testing her weight in the new shoes, and the sergeant smiled. "Good fit. Next." Fuchida's throat constricted. The sergeant noticed him staring. "Help you, sir?" No hostility, just a question. Fuchida couldn't speak. His English deserted him. The sergeant must have seen something in his face. He gestured to the mountain of shoeboxes stacked behind the distribution point. Hundreds of them, sorted by size, labeled in English and hastily scrawled Japanese. You got kids? Fuchida managed a nod. Bring 'em by. We've got plenty. The sergeant turned back to his work, already kneeling for the next child. Plenty. The word detonated in Fuchida's chest. He'd walked past civilians eating rice mixed with sawdust to survive, past children burning furniture for warmth because there was no coal, past a mother begging for scraps outside the base because her baby was dying of malnutrition. And here was an armed conqueror kneeling in enemy soil, tying shoelaces for the enemy's children. Not because he had to, not for propaganda, just because there were shoes and children who needed them, and that was apparently enough. Fuchida thought of the ice cream at Camp McCoy, the B-29 manual left unguarded, the mail service that found his wife in a city with no infrastructure, every piece of evidence stacking higher, forming a conclusion he could no longer avoid. This wasn't wealth. It was a different understanding of what strength meant. Japan had taught him that power came from sacrifice, from accepting suffering, from rationing rice and melting temple bells into bullets and sending pilots into the sky with no fuel to return. Strength through scarcity, victory through discipline. But this sergeant, this enemy soldier, had so much abundance he could waste time fitting shoes, could afford to care about comfort for children who would never thank him in a language he understood, could kneel in the dirt because he was so strong he didn't need to prove anything. The Americans hadn't just won the war. They'd won it so completely they could afford mercy. Fuchida's hands were shaking. He thought of his commanders in the last days, screaming about Yamato Damashi, the warrior spirit, as if courage could stop B-29s, as if discipline could conjure fuel from empty tanks, as if sacrifice made weakness into strength. But the Americans had proven the opposite. Their strength created freedom to choose kindness. Their abundance enabled the luxury of forgiveness. They were kneeling because they were powerful enough that they didn't need to stand over anyone. The sergeant helped another child to her feet, checking her shoe fit with the same patient thoroughness. Behind him, a corporal distributed blankets. To his left, a medic was cleaning a boy's infected foot before fitting him with socks and shoes. No cameras, no fanfare, just Americans doing their jobs. And apparently, their job description included caring for enemy children. That night, Fuchida led his own children through the base gate. His son held his sister's hand, both terrified of the foreign soldiers. Fuchida's pride writhed inside him, the humiliation of bringing his children to beg from conquerors. The same sergeant was still there, now working by floodlight. He saw Fuchida approach, recognized him, smiled, waved them forward. How old? He asked, pointing to Fuchida's son. 8, Fuchida managed in broken English. The sergeant pulled boxes, found the right size on the second try, knelt again, fitted the shoes with the same gentle patience he'd shown the stranger's daughter that afternoon. Fuchida's son looked up at his father, confused by the kindness. When both children wore new shoes and clean socks, the sergeant pressed a paper bag into Fuchida's hands. Oranges, he said. Kids need vitamin C. Fuchida stared at the bag. Real oranges. Not dried, not preserved. Fresh fruit flown across an ocean to feed conquered children. His daughter asked in Japanese, Papa, why are the Americans so nice? Every answer he'd been taught evaporated. American decadence, Western weakness, democratic corruption. All the propaganda dissolved in the face of a sergeant who'd spent 12 hours fitting shoes he'd never worn, for children he'd never see again. Fuchida had no words. He bowed, deeper than protocol required, deeper than pride allowed, and led his children home through streets that smelled of ash. His son walked differently in shoes that fit. His daughter clutched the orange bag like treasure. This was the weapon that had truly defeated Japan. Not the atom bomb, not the firebombing, not even the industrial might he'd seen in the manuals and statistics. It was this. Abundance so extreme, it permitted mercy. Strength so complete, it enabled gentleness. A nation so powerful, it could kneel before its enemies' children and tie their shoes. The ice cream had confused him. The library had stunned him. The mail service had amazed him. But this shattered the last piece of the world he'd believed in. Japan lost because it fought a nation that could afford to forgive. That measured victory not in enemy dead, but in enemy children fed. That was strong enough to kneel without fear. Fuchida understood, finally. The war was over the moment it began, not because of carriers or bombers or bombs. Because you cannot defeat people who feed your children better than you can. The auditorium in Brookings, Oregon smells like floor wax and fresh coffee. 17 years have passed since surrender. Mitsuo Fuchida stands in the wings, straightening his tie. A simple blue knit, American-made. His hands shake slightly. Not from fear. From the weight of the moment. Beside him, Nobuo Fujita stares at the curtain like a man awaiting execution. Fujita is smaller than Fuchida remembers from their brief meeting in 1943. Smaller and older and terrified. He flew a submarine-launched seaplane over this exact town in September 1942. Dropped incendiary bombs trying to start forest fires that would rage across Oregon. The fires never caught. The attack failed. But Fujita bombed American soil. And now, he's returned. They invited us, Fuchida says quietly in Japanese. Remember that. Fujita doesn't respond. His breathing is shallow. The mayor, thick-shouldered man named Tex Kramer, pokes his head backstage. Ready, gentlemen? Fuchida nods. They walk into the light. The room holds maybe 200 people. Veterans in their American Legion caps. Townspeople in Sunday clothes. A photographer from the local paper. Fuchida scans their faces for hatred and finds only curiosity. Perhaps nervousness. No one is holding weapons. Mayor Kramer approaches the podium. Folks, I know this is unusual. Some of you probably think I'm crazy. Scattered, uncomfortable laughter. But this town has an opportunity today to do something important. Something that matters more than old grudges. Fuchida watches Fujita from the corner of his eye. The pilot's face has gone gray. In 1942, Mr. Nobuo Fujita bombed our forest. Could have killed people. Could have burned down half the state if the wind had been different. Kramer pauses. Instead, we put out the fires and went on with our lives. And Mr. Fujita went on with his war, and we went on with ours. And now the war's over, and we're all still here. The mayor reaches beneath the podium and lifts out a long object wrapped in burgundy velvet. Fujita's knees buckle slightly. Fuchida grabs his elbow to steady him. After the attack, we found this near the crash site of one of the incendiary devices, Kramer says, unwrapping the bundle with careful hands. The cloth falls away. Steel catches the light. A katana, its blade immaculate, its handle wrapped in traditional silk. We did some research. 400 years old. Family heirloom. We've been keeping it safe. The room has gone absolutely silent. Mr. Fujita, Kramer says, extending the sword, we'd like to give this back. And we'd like to make you an honorary citizen of Brookings, if you'll have us. Fujita doesn't move. Fuchida sees tears streaming down the pilot's face, dripping onto his collar. Fujita walks forward like a man in a dream, takes the sword with both shaking hands, and bows so low his forehead nearly touches his knees. I am so sorry, Fujita says in broken English. So sorry. Kramer rests a big hand on Fujita's shoulder. We know. That's why we wanted you to come back. The applause starts slowly, then builds. An old woman in the front row stands. Then another veteran. Within seconds, the entire room is on its feet. Fuchida watches, unable to speak. He thinks of Camp McCoy. Ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon. Manuals left unguarded on library shelves. The sergeant on his knees, tying a Japanese child's shoes. All of it leads here, to this room, this moment, this impossible forgiveness. After the ceremony, people cluster around Fujita, shaking his hand, welcoming him. Fujita stands apart, observing, until an old man approaches. Thin, weathered, wearing a VFW cap with pins Fujita recognizes. Pacific Theater ribbons. "Commander Fujita?" the man asks. "Yes." The man reaches into his wallet and pulls out a laminated card. USS Arizona Survivor's Certificate. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The ship Fujita's bombers sank in 9 minutes, taking 1,177 men down with her. Fujita's mouth goes dry. I was in the forward magazine, the man says. His voice is steady, quiet. Got out through a porthole. Watched her burn all day. He taps the certificate. I earned this because of you, because of what you ordered that morning. I have no defense, Fujita says. I can offer no justification. I'm not asking for one. The veteran folds the certificate carefully, returns it to his wallet. I'm telling you I should hate you. By every reasonable measure, I should want you dead. Fujita waits. But I don't, the man says. You know why? No. Because you proved something I needed to see. The veteran glances toward Fujita, still surrounded by Brookings residents. That people can change, that enemies can become brothers, that we can bomb each other's cities and sink each other's ships and still find our way back to being human. Fujita's throat constricts. That's the real victory, isn't it? The man continues. Not who had the bigger bombs or more factories. Whether we can stop being enemies. Your country made that possible, Fujita manages. Japan taught us that strength comes from sacrifice, from scarcity. We believed abundance made you weak. And now? Now I understand abundance gave you the freedom to choose mercy. You fed my children. You returned his sword. You could afford forgiveness because you were so strong you didn't need revenge. The veteran extends his hand. Frank Morrison, Bakersfield, California. Fujita shakes it. Morrison's grip is firm, warm. I hear you're a preacher now, Morrison says. I tell my story. How I discovered what kind of nation wins wars. What kind is that? Fujita looks around the room. At Fujita crying with gratitude. At the mayor beaming. At the townspeople who invited their bomber home. The kind that can kneel in the dirt to tie an enemy child's shoes. The kind that wastes ice cream on prisoners. The kind that gives back swords. Morrison nods slowly. That's the America I fought for. Wasn't always sure it existed. Good to see proof. They stand together in companionable silence. Two old warriors watching reconciliation unfold. Fujita thinks about his whole journey. From Pearl Harbor's commander, to Camp McCoy's prisoner, to this moment in Oregon. Every step forced him to unlearn something he'd believed absolutely. Japan lost because we thought suffering made us strong, Fujita realizes. America won because their abundance made them kind. A photographer approaches. Mr. Fujita, Mr. Morrison, would you mind? They stand together for the picture. The flash pops. Fujita blinks away the after image and sees Fujita being embraced by Mayor Kramer. The samurai sword cradled between them like something precious returned. This, Fujita thinks, is what I'll remember. Not the bombs, not the battles. This. Outside, the Oregon afternoon is clear and bright. Fujita stands on the town hall steps, breathing air that smells like pine and ocean. Morrison joins him, lighting a cigarette. You heading back to Japan? Morrison asks. Eventually. I speak at churches. Tell them what I learned. What's that? Fujita considers the question carefully. That the war ended the moment I saw ice cream in a prison camp. Everything after was just waiting for my country to realize what I already knew. We were fighting people who could afford to waste. Morrison exhales smoke. Hell of a thing to lose to. Hell of a thing to learn from. Inside, someone starts playing piano. A hymn Fuchida recognizes from his American church tours. Amazing Grace. The irony isn't lost on him. An English hymn in an American town, celebrating reconciliation with Japanese warriors. Fujita emerges, still clutching the sword, his face transformed. He sees Fuchida and breaks into a wide, astonished smile. They gave it back, Fujita says in Japanese, almost laughing. They kept it safe for 20 years and gave it back. I know. How is this possible? Fuchida thinks of children's shoes, of mail delivered across a defeated ocean, of library shelves stocked with secrets, of soldiers who became brothers. Because they could afford it, he says simply. Because they were so strong, they didn't need to be cruel. Fujita bows to the sword, then to the town hall, then to the Oregon sky. Fuchida understands. He spent 17 years trying to explain this revelation, that America's true weapon wasn't atomic, wasn't industrial. It was moral abundance enabled by material wealth, the luxury of being kind. The afternoon lengthens. They stand together, two warriors from a defeated empire, welcomed home by people who should have hated them. This is what won the war, Fuchida thinks one final time. Not the weapon that fell from the Enola Gay. The weapon that wins is the one you don't have to use.